there's a moment, right before a man finally admits he's in love, where he starts becoming someone even he doesn't recognize. Not softer, not weaker, just quieter inside. And if you've ever met someone who made the noise in your head go silent for a few seconds, then you already know exactly what I'm talking about. Because when two people are truly meant for each other, it usually does not begin with certainty. It begins with disruption. You stop performing, you stop trying so hard to win, and suddenly the attention you used to crave from everyone else feels strangely empty compared to one honest conversation with her at 1:12 in the morning. That's the part nobody prepares men for. Not the excitement, the rearrangement, the way one person can walk into your life and quietly expose how emotionally exhausted you've been for years. And before we go deeper into this, if you've ever felt something you couldn't explain but couldn't forget either, stay with me. Subscribe if this kind of conversation is rare for you. Some videos entertain you for 10 minutes. I want this one to stay in your chest for a while. Because most men watching this have been taught a completely wrong idea about soulmates. They think it means ease, compatibility, no confusion, no distance, no emotional friction. But real connection, the kind that changes you, almost always begins by unsettling your identity first. You meet her and suddenly your usual patterns stop working. The emotional detachment that protected you for years, it starts feeling heavy instead of safe. The conversations with women you used to chase so easily, they begin to feel thin, predictable. And this terrifies a lot of men, even the confident ones, because now there's actually something to lose. You know what's strange? A man can sleep beside someone for years and never feel emotionally seen. Then one woman looks at him for 3 seconds too long, and his entire nervous system reacts like it's been found. Not because she's perfect, not because she's magical, because for the first time, he doesn't feel like he has to edit himself to be accepted. That's rare, extremely rare, especially for men. A lot of men don't realize how lonely they are emotionally until they encounter someone who makes loneliness impossible to ignore anymore. And when that happens, something very specific begins. He starts remembering parts of himself he abandoned. Music affects him differently. Silence feels different. Even his room at night feels different. He checks his phone pretending he doesn't care, replays conversations he claims were nothing, feels irrationally calm when she's okay, and deeply unsettled when she pulls away emotionally, even slightly. And no, this isn't obsession. There's a difference. Obsession consumes your reality, but soulmate-level connection confronts it. It forces you to see the gap between who you are and who you became just to survive disappointment. That's why these connections often arrive during emotionally inconvenient times. When you're rebuilding, when you're emotionally numb, when you've convinced yourself you no longer need anyone. Because life is strange like that. The heart usually opens right after the ego says, "I'm fine alone." And some of you listening already know her face. You already know the exact conversation that shifted something inside you. The dangerous part is, you probably also know you've been trying to minimize what you felt ever since. Because if it was real, then you can't hide behind detachment anymore. Men rarely talk honestly about what happens after they meet someone who genuinely reaches them emotionally. Not lust, not infatuation. I mean the kind of connection that follows them home afterward. The kind that sits beside them while they're driving, while they're working, while they're pretending to laugh with other people. Because when two soulmates are truly meant for each other, one of the first things that happens is resistance, internal resistance. And it usually comes from the man, not because he doesn't care, because he cares enough for it to scare him. A lot of men have spent years mastering emotional control. They know how to stay composed, useful, desired, independent, even impressive. But very few know how to feel safe being emotionally transparent. That's a completely different skill. So what happens? He starts pulling back in small ways. Not fully disappearing, just regulating the intensity, taking longer to reply, becoming more logical, more measured with his words. And outwardly, it can look confusing, sometimes even cold. But internally, he's trying to understand why one woman suddenly has access to emotions he buried under discipline, routines, goals, distractions, all the things that helped him survive. I've had men describe this feeling to me in ways they were almost embarrassed to admit. One told me, "I hated how much peace I felt around her." Think about that sentence. Not excitement, not obsession, peace. And he hated it because peace feels dangerous when your identity was built around emotional self-protection. Some men become addicted to emotional chaos because chaos feels familiar. So when real intimacy arrives quietly, they mistrust it. They look for flaws, distance, timing issues, anything to reduce the vulnerability of what they're feeling. And this is where soulmate connections become psychologically fascinating, because they don't just create attraction, they expose unresolved grief. You suddenly realize how long it's been since someone asked how you were doing, and you answered honestly. You realize how performative your confidence became. How many relationships were built on convenience instead of emotional truth. And the worst part? You can't unsee it anymore. That's why these connections often trigger withdrawal phases. Not because the bond isn't real, because it is. A man who feels deeply seen will either lean into growth or retreat into emotional survival patterns. There's usually no middle ground, and women feel this shift immediately, even if they don't say it. She notices his energy change, the hesitation, the moments where he looks emotionally present one day, distant the next. But what she often doesn't realize is this. He's not only reacting to her, he's reacting to himself around her. That's the deeper conflict, because she accidentally became a mirror. And mirrors are uncomfortable when a man has spent years avoiding certain truths. Truths like, "I'm more emotionally affected than I pretend. I'm tired of superficial connections. I actually want closeness, but I'm terrified of depending on someone emotionally." That last one especially. Men are rarely taught how to hold emotional dependency in a healthy way, so when they start deeply caring about someone, it can feel destabilizing instead of beautiful at first. That's why soulmate connections often include periods of emotional confusion, not games, not manipulation, just two nervous systems trying to decide if it's safe to stop pretending. And the silence during this stage can become unbearable. He drafts messages he never sends, checks her profile, then acts detached when she reaches out, tries to focus on work while mentally replaying tiny details she probably forgot 5 minutes later. The way she looked at him when he admitted something vulnerable, the pause before she answered, the softness in her voice when she said his name differently one night. These things stay with men longer than they admit, much longer, especially the men who appear the most emotionally controlled on the surface. Because underneath discipline is often deprivation. And when a deprived heart finally encounters emotional nourishment, it doesn't know whether to drink or run. There's another thing that happens when two people are truly meant for each other. The connection starts exposing timing wounds neither of them fully healed. And this is where men become deeply conflicted. Because sometimes she enters his life at the exact moment he's finally getting himself together. Financially, mentally, emotionally, or at least trying to. And instead of feeling ready for love, he feels interrupted by it. That sounds harsh, but it's real. A lot of men secretly believe they must become worthy before they allow themselves to be fully loved. So when a woman sees value in them before they've arrived, it creates tension inside them. Part of him wants to fall into the connection completely. The other part keeps thinking, not yet. Once I fix my life, once I become more stable, once I'm certain. But soulmate connections don't usually wait for emotional perfection. They arrive when something inside you is unfinished. That's why they feel so disruptive. And what's heartbreaking is, sometimes the man mistakes emotional intensity for bad timing, when in reality it's the first emotionally honest thing he's experienced in years. So he starts negotiating with his feelings, reducing them intellectually, calling it too complicated, trying to stay rational. But emotions don't disappear just because they're inconvenient. They leak into his sleep, into random moments during the day, into the strange heaviness he feels after talking to her. You know what many men do when they genuinely love someone but feel emotionally unprepared? They become inconsistent. Not intentionally cruel, just internally divided. One day he's deeply present. The next day he disappears into himself. And the woman often interprets this as lack of interest when sometimes it's actually emotional overload. Because deep connection forces a man to confront the possibility of loss. And if he has experienced betrayal, rejection, abandonment, humiliation, even years earlier, his nervous system remembers. Men carry heartbreak differently than people think. Quieter, less expressive, but deeper than they admit. Some men never fully recover from the first time they gave someone their emotional trust and watched it get mishandled. After that, they become strategic with vulnerability, careful, controlled, detached when necessary. So when a soulmate connection begins breaking through those defenses naturally, it can feel both beautiful and terrifying at the same time, especially at night. Because nighttime removes distractions. That's when honesty gets louder. He lays there replaying moments he pretended didn't matter, wondering why her absence suddenly feels physical, why certain songs now sound like memories, why he misses her most when his life finally becomes quiet. And this is usually the moment he realizes something difficult. He is no longer emotionally unaffected. That identity is gone now. The man who never catches feelings, the man who stays detached, the man who can walk away easily. He starts noticing cracks in that persona. And strangely, this often makes him pull away even more at first. Not because he wants less connection, because he's afraid of how much he wants it. That distinction matters. A man who doesn't care becomes careless. A man who deeply cares often becomes cautious, overly cautious. And unfortunately, soulmate connections are rarely clean in the beginning because both people are trying to protect old wounds while reaching for new intimacy simultaneously. It creates emotional whiplash, moments of incredible closeness followed by distance that feels almost unbearable. But if the connection is real, neither person fully forgets it during separation. That's the part people don't talk about enough. Real emotional alignment leaves traces, even after silence, even after pride, even after months of trying to move on. Because some people don't merely enter your life, they alter your emotional blueprint. And once that happens, every shallow interaction afterwards starts feeling emotionally loud in the worst possible way. What surprises men the most about soulmate connections is how ordinary the important moments seem while they're happening. It's rarely some dramatic movie scene. Usually it's something painfully simple. She listens differently. That's it. And suddenly he's saying things he never planned to say. Not because she forced vulnerability out of him, but because her presence made performance feel unnecessary for a minute. A lot of men don't realize how exhausting it is to constantly manage perception, to always appear composed, capable, desired, untouchable. Then one woman comes along and notices the tiredness underneath the confidence, and instead of judging it, she stays emotionally present. That affects men more deeply than most will ever admit publicly, because many men are starving for emotional safety while pretending they only want freedom. There's a difference. Freedom says, no one can hurt me. Safety says, I don't have to hide here. And when two soulmates are truly meant for each other, masks begin slipping without effort. Not strategically, naturally. He stops trying to sound impressive all the time. She stops pretending she's unaffected. The conversations become less polished, but more honest. And honesty is intimate in a way attraction alone can never be. That's why some connections become unforgettable without ever becoming official. People assume intensity comes from labels. It doesn't. It comes from emotional recognition. The feeling of being psychologically understood by someone who was never supposed to matter this much. And once that recognition happens, both people begin noticing changes in themselves. He becomes more reflective, more emotionally aware, sometimes even softer with people outside the relationship. Not weak, just less emotionally numb. That's an important distinction. There's this myth that real masculine strength means emotional distance. But emotionally healthy men are not empty men. They're men who can remain open without collapsing. And soulmate connections often force that evolution, painfully, slowly. Because she unintentionally challenges the coping mechanisms he built years ago. The sarcasm, the emotional avoidance, the habit of turning everything into humor before it gets too real. She sees through it eventually, not aggressively, just quietly. And weirdly enough, that's what makes him trust her more. Not because she idolizes him, because she perceives him accurately and still stays. That combination is rare, very rare, especially for men who have spent most of their lives feeling useful instead of genuinely valued. A man can receive attention from many women and still feel emotionally invisible. But one emotionally attuned woman can change the entire emotional climate of his life. That's why these connections become difficult to replace. Not because she was perfect, because she reached parts of him others never slowed down enough to notice. His exhaustion, his restraint, the sadness underneath his discipline, even the way he goes quiet when something matters too much. And eventually, he starts realizing something uncomfortable. He feels more like himself around her than he does around almost anyone else. That realization changes everything, because now losing the connection doesn't just feel like losing a person, it feels like losing access to a version of himself he missed. And this is where fear becomes dangerous. Some men sabotage soulmate connections not because they want out, but because they become terrified of emotional dependency. Terrified that loving someone this deeply gives fate too much power over their peace. So they hesitate, delay, overthink. Meanwhile, the woman feels the emotional inconsistency and begins protecting herself too. Now both people are standing there, deeply connected, but equally afraid. And honestly, that's the tragedy of many real soulmate bonds. Not lack of love, lack of emotional courage at the same time. There's a point in these connections that most people never talk about honestly. It doesn't feel like falling in love anymore. It feels like standing too close to something that can change you permanently. And you start noticing something unsettling. Even when you're not together, you're still emotionally reacting to each other. A message doesn't arrive and your mood shifts without permission. A short reply feels heavier than it should. A sudden moment of warmth from her can calm a whole day you didn't even realize was tense. This is where men often start questioning themselves more deeply. Not just the relationship, themselves. Because she's not doing anything extreme. She's just present in a way that makes emotional absence impossible to ignore. And that creates pressure inside him. Not external pressure, internal. The kind that whispers, if this matters this much, I could lose control of my emotional balance. And for many men, control has been the foundation of their identity. Control over reactions, control over vulnerability, control over how much someone is allowed to affect them. So when one woman begins bypassing that control naturally, it doesn't just feel romantic, it feels exposing. And exposure, emotionally, can feel like danger to someone who has learned to survive by staying composed. So he tries to recalibrate. He becomes more careful with what he shows, more intentional with distance. Not because he's lying, but because he's trying to stabilize something that feels too emotionally real too fast. Meanwhile, she's usually sensing everything, even what isn't being said. That's the difficult part of deep connection. It creates a kind of emotional transparency neither person can fully escape. And when emotional transparency meets fear, things get complicated quickly. He starts asking himself questions he didn't expect to ask about someone he didn't plan to feel this much for. Why does she stay in my mind so easily? Why does silence feel different with her? Why do I feel more honest when I'm tired around her than when I'm fully prepared? And underneath all of that is a quieter realization. She didn't become important through effort. She became important through emotional resonance. That's what makes it difficult to rationalize, because effort can be dismissed, but resonance cannot. It stays, even when logic tries to reduce it, even when circumstances don't align, even when timing feels inconvenient. And this is usually the stage where men start to feel a subtle fear of loss, not just of her, but of the version of themselves that only exists when she is emotionally near. That's a strange feeling to sit with. Missing someone who is still alive in your life, but not consistently emotionally available. It creates a kind of internal tension that is hard to name. So instead of naming it, many men retreat into thinking, overthinking, trying to solve something that was never meant to be solved like a problem. Because connection like this isn't a puzzle, it's an experience. And experiences aren't controlled, they're felt. But when feeling becomes too intense, thinking takes over. And thinking always tries to create distance. Distance from uncertainty, distance from emotional dependency, distance from the possibility of getting hurt. So what looks like confusion on the outside is often just a man trying not to feel overwhelmed by something he actually values deeply. And somewhere in that emotional push and pull, both people begin to wonder the same thing in different ways. If this feels this real, why does it still feel so fragile? There's a moment in some connections where everything goes quiet. Not because it ended, but because something inside both people finally understands the truth. And it's not always a comfortable truth. It's this: real emotional connection doesn't collapse because it wasn't real. It collapses because it wasn't held in the same emotional language at the same time. One person leans in, the other hesitates. One opens, the other processes. One feels, the other thinks. And in that gap, distance grows. Not always physically, emotionally, silently. And if you've ever been in something like this, you know exactly what I mean. It doesn't end with a dramatic moment. It ends with subtle reduction, fewer messages, shorter replies, less emotional risk taken on both sides. And yet, the feeling doesn't disappear in either person. It just stops being expressed. For men especially, this stage often comes with a strange internal contradiction. On the surface, he may tell himself it was too complicated, not the right time, or not sustainable. But underneath that narrative, there is usually something more honest happening. He is grieving something he never fully allowed himself to name out loud. Because naming it would require admitting how deeply it affected him. And vulnerability, when unpracticed, feels like exposure. So instead, he does what many men do. He intellectualizes what he felt, reduces it, reframes it, tries to make it smaller so it's easier to carry. But the body doesn't forget what the mind edits. He still remembers her tone during certain conversations, still remembers how different he felt after talking to her when life was heavy, still remembers moments where he wasn't performing, just existing. And those memories don't argue back, they simply stay. Meanwhile, she has her own version of silence too, wondering where the emotional consistency went, trying to understand what changed without clear explanation. And both people, in their own way, are left holding fragments of something that once felt whole. This is where the myth of meant to be often gets misunderstood. Because being meant for each other doesn't always mean staying together effortlessly. Sometimes it means being significant enough to change how you understand emotional connection forever, even if the timing doesn't align for continuation. And that truth can be difficult for men to accept because it removes the fantasy of control. It forces acceptance of emotional reality rather than emotional outcome. But here's something important to understand, especially if you're watching this alone right now. A meaningful connection that didn't fully stabilize is not proof that it wasn't real. It's often proof that it touched something real inside you, something that was already there, something that didn't begin with her, but was revealed through her presence. And that changes you. Quietly, permanently. Not in dramatic ways, in subtle ones. You become more aware of emotional depth, less tolerant of superficial connection, more honest with yourself about what you actually need, not just what you can tolerate. And even if two people don't continue together in the way they once imagined, they don't fully return to who they were before they met. Because once someone reaches you at that level, you don't go back. You integrate it, you learn from it, and sometimes you spend a long time understanding it afterward. Not as regret, but as recognition. That for a moment, you experience something emotionally real enough to change the way you see love itself. And maybe that's the quiet truth behind all of this. Soulmate connections aren't always about holding on. Sometimes, they're about becoming someone who can finally recognize what real emotional closeness feels like when it shows up again.